What if I revealed to you that India's so-called rise is not just another news headline, but the comeback of one of the oldest civilizations on Earth? Because make no mistake, it absolutely is. For centuries, India was broken, looted, chained, written off as weak, a giant asleep. But today it doesn't just stand, it roars back, not merely as a country, but as a timeless force awakening after centuries. How did this happen? Not by luck, but through 10 hidden, powerful, and shockingly misunderstood secrets. Secrets that forge this silent superpower. Stay with me, you need to know these. Whenever India comes up, people throw around words: emerging power, developing market, regional player. But if that's all you see, you're missing 99% of the story. And you're dead wrong. Because India didn't simply rise in 75 years. India is a civilization that never truly fell. That is a game changer. That ancient continuity, that is India's first and greatest weapon. Look at other nations. They might talk about 300 years of history, some kings, some wars. Maybe they'll throw in a philosopher or two if they're lucky. But India reaches back thousands of years. Thousands. Back into the mists of epics, emperors, ancient science, languages, and living traditions that refuse to die. These aren't dusty museum pieces. They are breathing, living, roaring realities. That creates a psychological steel, a knowing that your people have endured the unthinkable. That your story didn't begin with colonizers or factories, but with rivers, stars, and songs. It began with rivers still worshipped, rituals still echoing at dawn today, unbroken. A worldview so vast that even today, scientists, psychologists, spiritual seekers, all turn to India for answers. This is bigger than nationalism. This is about unstoppable continuity. A cultural memory so deep, it outlived kingdoms, conquests, even collective amnesia. Even when India was ripped apart politically, its civilizational heart kept pounding, unbroken. In its stories, in its songs, in its quiet courage. In grandmothers passing down secret wisdom hidden in simple daily routines. In festivals that made sense of chaos, turned suffering into celebration. In a resilience that taught millions to suffer without turning hateful. To survive without shrinking. To rise without losing soul. That is a quiet power, but it is a terrifying power for any enemy. A power born not of gold or guns, but of a core identity that refuses to die. A calm knowing, we've been here before. We survived worse. We will not break. Now pause. Think about what that means strategically. Most nations, crushed by colonizers, lose their soul. Sure, they rebuild, but often as something smaller, lesser, something uprooted, hollowed out. But India? It absorbed the blows and kept its essence alive. Persians came, Mongols came, the British came. They tried to change India, yes, but they could not erase it. They could not. Because they weren't fighting just a state, they were fighting a civilization. That matters now. Because real power today is not just tanks and treaties. It comes from knowing your story so deeply, no one else can define you. And that's why India's power today is rising. Because its people are remembering who they truly are. Not just in their heads, but in their hearts too. They are waking up to their inheritance. Not just the pride of their ancestors, but the responsibility of carrying it forward. There is a fire spreading across generations. A fire that cannot be put out. Young minds writing code by day, chanting ancient mantras by night, unstoppable. Engineers respecting the earth, not because it's woke, but because they know it's sacred. Artists, scientists, soldiers, teachers, realizing they are not children of a broken colony. They are the torchbearers of one of the world's oldest living wisdoms. And don't you dare call this romantic nonsense. This is strategy pure and simple. When you draw from something older than pain, older than fear, you stop reacting. You start choosing. You stop begging. You build. You shape your own destiny. That's why India is so hard to predict on the world stage. Not chaotic, just unreadable by the world's usual playbook. Other nations crumble when identity gets questioned. India braids those questions into its story. India has the muscle memory to hold modern and ancient, global and local, rational and mystical, all at once, in one unstoppable breath. And this is not feel-good pride. This is power. A nation that knows itself cannot be broken by headlines. It can't be shaken by recessions or political games. It absorbs, reflects, adapts, and responds on its own terms. So if you want to know why India is powerful, start here, with its civilizational core, with the unshakable truth. India never tried to be anyone else. It was only trying to remember who it already was. And now that its memory has awakened, India is not just rising, it is returning to claim its place. A return that doesn't scream, but speaks with the unstoppable weight of centuries behind it. A return that doesn't conquer with swords, but leads the world with its stories. A return that doesn't erase cultures, but invites the world to meet its timeless, newly reawakened soul. Once you see that, you stop asking if India will win. You start asking, how high will India soar? Because its roots run so deep, they can lift it to the skies. If you really want to see what fuels India, the hidden engine that transforms its people, you have to look beyond GDP and growth charts. You have to peer into the unseen, the inner spaces where India shapes minds, molds souls, and teaches a balance no textbook could ever explain. India's strength was never just about politics or nuclear power alone. It has always been about training the inner world, about building humans who are rooted, reflective, and unstoppable in their quiet determination. And that kind of power doesn't begin in fancy colleges. It begins at home, not through loud slogans, but through lived values woven into daily life. Children raised not just on what to think, but how to sit with their own thoughts, how to observe their own mind, how to trace emotion, action, and consequence, like a warrior of the mind. In India, silence is never empty. It is full, alive, sacred. A pause is not just a break, it's space to reflect. You won't find this on a balance sheet, but it creates people who can handle pressure, chaos, contradiction, without breaking. That is no accident. It is the result of thousands of years of tradition that values the inner life just as much as the outer life. India never split intellect from spirit, it fused them as two sides of the same coin. While the world tried to break science away from spirit, India insisted on integration. India never divided the human being into separate boxes. It saw the person as a whole. You could be a coder and a poet, a scientist and a sage, a fighter and a philosopher, all at once. That balance between fierce action and calm stillness, that is India's backbone. Even under colonial rule, even while starving, India's inner compass never died. It might have gone underground, but it never vanished. In secret books, in temples, in whispered chants, the knowledge stayed alive. And when the world was ready, it rose again, not as a relic, but as a powerful answer to modern emptiness. Just look around today. You see nations dripping with money, with weapons, with influence, yet their people starve for meaning, drowning in anxiety and burnout. India, even without knowing it, has a spiritual immune system the world is craving. Not because India claims to know everything, but because it knows how to live with questions. India never demanded black and white answers. It cultivated depth. That's why the world's greatest minds still come to India, not to lecture, but to learn. Not because India is some exotic circus, but because it preserves something rare. An approach to life that blends discipline, compassion, curiosity, and humility in one sacred breath. A wisdom that doesn't just teach how to win, but how to suffer with dignity, how to endure defeat without destroying yourself, how to stand with dignity even when the world tries to rip away your worth. That hidden force, that emotional and spiritual intelligence, is India's greatest export. You can't bottle it, can't put it on a spreadsheet, but it is very real. It's why you see Indian kids working 16 hours a day abroad and not complaining, because their minds were trained not just for ambition, but to detach from outcomes. It's why, in a crisis, be it pandemic, flood, or war, Indian communities quietly organize. Feeding, healing, helping, without drama, without applause. Not to show off, but because they see service as strength, not a sacrifice. And that strength isn't passive. It doesn't just hide. It steps back into the world with clarity, with conscience, refusing to lose its humanity in the rat race. That's why India's spiritual traditions were never about running away. They were about sharpening the mind, opening the heart, and preparing you to move through this world without letting it consume you. And today, that spirit rises again. Not just in monks, but in engineers, coders, diplomats, artists, warriors of the modern age. You see young Indians building apps by day, sitting in sacred silence by night. They pitch startups with confidence, yet still bow to their elders with grace. They speak global English, yes, but their mother tongues still drum through them like a second heartbeat. That fusion of intellect and inner calm, unstoppable. Because in a world that's frantic, fragmented, and anxious, India offers something priceless: depth, an intelligence that doesn't just ask, what can I build, but also, who am I becoming while I build? That quiet, inconvenient question is India's true superpower. That's why India's rise feels so different. Not an explosion, but a steady sunrise. Not loud, but utterly unstoppable. And in that patient glow, there is a message to the world that real power isn't just knowing how to win, it's knowing why you even play the game. There's a kind of strength the world still misunderstands. It doesn't come wrapped in noise or chest thumping. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't wave flags or chant slogans to prove itself. It waits. It watches. It listens, with patience sharper than any sword. And when the moment is right, it moves, not to impress, but to endure, to reshape, to grow. This subtle, unbreakable strength, that's what India has mastered. Not by reading textbooks, but by living through centuries of storms. It is the strength of strategic patience. For centuries, India has absorbed more trauma than most nations could even imagine surviving. It has been invaded, ruled, looted, divided, lied about, twisted. It's been told it's too poor, too spiritual, too messy to ever be powerful. But every time the world tried to break it, India rose again. Not in a burst, but steadily, like roots cracking stone. Not with rage, but with relentless resolve. The world worships the loud, the flashy, the instant. But India's genius? It's different. It lies in how India adapts, learns, and endures, without ever losing its soul. When invaders arrived, India didn't just fight and didn't just run. It absorbed, it learned, it borrowed their tools, their languages, but it never let go of its core. That is not weakness. That is survival, supreme. That is strategy born not from fear, but from deep wisdom. Because for a civilization as old as India, time is never the enemy. Time is an ally. While others panic over quarterly profits or elections, India thinks in generations. That doesn't mean India won't act. It means it acts differently, calculated, considered, with a memory that goes back millennia. Even when colonial powers broke its economy and starved its people, India did not vanish. It reorganized itself, piece by piece. It kept teaching, kept passing on wisdom in quiet whispers, hidden from the conquerors. Even when its voice was stolen, its stories refused to die. Even with its hands in chains, its mind kept spinning ideas. And when independence finally arrived, India did not come out empty-handed. It emerged with an inner compass, built not just by freedom fighters, but by poets, saints, reformers, and millions of ordinary souls. They carried fragments of ancient wisdom through the darkest decades. That's why even today, when India feels global pressure, diplomatic, military, economic, it does not panic. It does not react like others do. That is not weakness. That is discernment. It studies, it absorbs, it calculates every angle. Not out of confusion, but because it knows the price of a reckless move. And when India does respond, it is unexpected, unconventional, rooted in its own timeless worldview. This patience does not make India slow. It makes India indestructible. It allows India to change without ever collapsing. Look at its democracy. 1 billion voices, hundreds of languages, countless faiths, chaos could have ruled. Instead, you see order, not perfect, but persistent. You see people who learn to listen, not just talk. They argue without tearing themselves apart. They protest without burning their own home to ashes. That is not just politics, that is cultural wisdom refined over centuries. Even in modern growth, India has refused to blindly copy the West. It has taken its time, made mistakes, turned back, tried again. Because its goal was never to rush for empty applause. It is to build something that lasts, something that will not collapse at the first storm. You see this in how India has embraced technology, not as a flashy toy for the rich, but as a bridge for the masses. You see it in how it respects sustainability, not because the UN demands it, but because balance with nature is in its DNA. Adaptability in India means flowing without losing its shape, and that is exactly what India has done. It has reinvented itself again and again through time, through kings and republics, through invaders and liberators, through famine and fortune. Every single time, India bends but never breaks. It may change its form, but never its soul. And now, as the world shifts through AI, climate chaos, rising dictatorships, India enters a new chapter. Not as a follower, but as a shaper of tomorrow. But it won't shape the world with pride or arrogance. It will do it the way it always has, by observing, moving carefully, letting its actions speak louder than its words. In a world obsessed with speed, India reminds us, endurance is a superior intelligence. That steady pace, anchored in purpose, can outlast any flashy sprint. That true adaptability is not weakness, it is unshakable confidence. Because only those sure of survival dare to change in the first place. And once you truly see these layers under India's calm exterior, you stop underestimating it. You stop judging it by how loud it shouts. You realize what's happening is not just growth. It's a civilizational reawakening. Strategic, steady, inevitable. Because India's rise is not a rocket blast. It is a mountain forming. In a world terrified of difference, India teaches a radical lesson. Strength comes from diversity. A quiet but potent truth. Strength is not about being one. It is about holding many together without ever falling apart. Unity, India shows, is not destroying difference, but carrying it with grace and resilience. That right there is India's miracle. Not just that it exists, but that it keeps existing as India in all its beautiful complexity. Think about it. Where else do a billion people wake up speaking countless tongues, eating different foods, praying to different gods, thinking different thoughts, yet moving together, still calling themselves one nation? Where else does a single street hold a mosque, a temple, a church, and a gurdwara side by side? Not perfectly, no, but with a rhythm of coexistence the world can barely imagine. Where else can a child from a tribal hut and a child from a city penthouse salute the same flag, sing the same anthem, call the same land home? This is not a happy accident. This is civilizational endurance. It is messy, hard-earned, and ongoing, but it is real. India has learned to live with contradiction for thousands of years. It has learned difference is not a problem to fix, but a treasure to hold. That lesson is one of India's greatest modern superpowers. Because the world today is fracturing over identity and beliefs, but India has lived that test for thousands of years, not always gracefully, not without scars, but with relentless persistence. And India's diversity goes beyond culture. It is intellectual, emotional, spiritual. In India, you can sit with someone who opposes everything you stand for and still pour them chai. Still argue, even furiously, but without trying to erase them. That is rare. That is precious. That is real power. It means India can handle disagreement without collapsing. India doesn't need sameness to survive. It needs conversation. Of course there are fights, of course there are divisions, but the truth is, beneath the noise, India always pulls itself back to common ground. There is something about this grand experiment, India, that keeps people returning to the table, again and again. Call it memory, call it habit, call it hope, but it is real. It is alive. It keeps the whole system breathing. So when the world asks, how can a place this chaotic survive? The answer is shockingly simple. Because India never erased its differences, it carried them. And by carrying them, it grew stronger. Because diversity demands conversation. It teaches unstoppable patience, It builds emotional muscles that no shallow efficiency ever could. India flexed those muscles not just to survive, but to create something rare. Look at its music, where a sitar meets a guitar with no fear, where ancient ragas dance with modern jazz. Look at its cinema, 5 languages, 1 story, and no one even blinks. Look at its elections, where a tribal woman can be president and a tea seller can be prime minister. That's not tokenism. That is radical transformation. That is the patient, unstoppable unfolding of a culture that values contribution over blind conformity. India's real magic? Even when people disagree, they still choose to belong. They still step forward to participate. They still fight, love, build, dream, all under one name, India. And in a world ripped apart by rage, India's messy, noisy, living unity is a superpower. Because India proves you don't need sameness to stand side by side. You only need to remember there is something holier than agreement. It's called relationship. It's called connection. The willingness to see the other not as an enemy, but as a mirror of something greater. It isn't easy. It never was. And yet India does it every single day, on its streets, in its homes, its schools, its families, everywhere. The idea of we doesn't kill the I, it includes it. That is the subtle genius of India, not to erase identity, but to braid it into a stronger fabric, a fabric woven with countless threads, each tense, each colorful, each essential. And this fabric, resilient, messy, beautiful, is what the world is finally noticing. Because power today is not just about domination. It comes from coherence, the ability to hold chaos without collapsing. And if there is one place on earth that lives that skill every day, it is India. So when you wonder why India is rising, look beyond its economy or tech or politics. It is in its people. Their gift to live side by side across centuries without giving up on each other. In India, diversity isn't a flaw. It is a strength worth defending. Unity is not handed out. It is built again and again, with patience, with friction, with love. So the question now isn't how India got strong. It's what will India do with that power? Because a nation's true power lives not in its past, but in the hands of its people. In your voice, your discipline, your courage, your choices. India did not rise in one night. It rose because generations carried something greater than themselves. And now, it's your turn. If you're a student, don't just chase grades, chase meaning. Learn not just for a job, learn for your nation. If you're a creator, don't just chase virality, dive deep. Build stories that make the world respect India. If you lead, remember, leadership is about conscience, not just control. Be firm, but fair. Be rooted, but visionary. And if you think you're ordinary, there is no such thing as just an ordinary Indian. Every time you speak truth, show patience, extend a hand instead of a finger, you build India. The world is watching, but history is listening. What will your chapter say? If these words lit a spark in you, don't stop here. Like, share, and tell us below, what is India's greatest strength in your eyes? And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because this conversation is just beginning. Not about who India was, but about who it is becoming. Stay sharp, stay informed,